I had never expected to find it, never even thought to look, but there it was, an old, delicate bracelet in the corner of the restaurant's lost and found box. As soon as I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. The small silver chain glistened under the harsh fluorescent light, the initials engraved on the plate were unmistakable, J.M. My heart slammed in my chest, my pulse racing as memories of a love long gone flooded my mind. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the bracelet, the letters carved so meticulously into the metal. It was his. No doubt about it. I had seen that bracelet many times before, worn by the man I once thought would be my forever. James. It had been nearly 3 years since I last saw him, nearly 3 years since the day he walked out of my life without a word. The pain still stung, a quiet ache that would never truly fade. The silence between us had been the hardest part to bear. We hadn't ended on bad terms, not really, but there was a finality to it, a sudden absence of his presence in every part of my life. I had tried to move on, tried to forget. But now, as I stood there holding that bracelet, it felt as if time had rewound itself. The memories rushed back with a brutal force. I had to know how it had gotten there. How had this bracelet, this symbol of our love, ended up in a forgotten box in a busy restaurant? The thought gnawed at me, twisting my stomach into knots. I looked around the room, hoping no one had seen me. I hadn't planned to be here today, hadn't meant to walk into this restaurant, the one we had frequented when everything was still good, when the world felt wide open and full of promise. Now it felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around me. But there I stood, holding a piece of him in my hands, unable to move, unable to make sense of the overwhelming flood of emotions. I glanced at the restaurant manager, who was busy sorting through another stack of misplaced coats and forgotten bags. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to ask about it without drawing attention to the fact that I was the one who recognized the bracelet. But how could I not? It was his. And no one else would ever understand the connection, the history between me and that simple piece of jewelry. I set the bracelet back down carefully, my fingers lingering on the smooth surface for just a moment longer. I felt a pang in my chest, an ache so familiar, yet so unwelcome. Why was it here? Why now? The memory of James wearing the bracelet on our first anniversary flashed before me. He had bought it for me, well, for himself, really, as a way to symbolize our bond. "We're connected, always," he had said, his voice full of that quiet certainty that I had always admired in him. I remembered how I had smiled, touched by the gesture, convinced that we were destined for something lasting, something real. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After that day, it was as if everything shifted. The months that followed were filled with tension, small disagreements that snowballed into bigger problems. And then one day, it was over. No explanations. No closure. Just silence, leaving me with nothing but questions and a heavy heart. And now, this bracelet. It didn't make sense. Why had he left it behind? Why hadn't he taken it with him? The last time we spoke, he had seemed so sure of his decision to leave, so resolute in his choice. There were no lingering looks, no last words. Just a finality that seemed to suffocate me. But this bracelet, it was something tangible, something real. It was a piece of him I had never expected to see again. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it again, feeling the cool metal between my fingers. I wanted to leave, to forget about it, to pretend like I hadn't even noticed. But I couldn't. There was something about it that held me there, rooted to the spot. Something about this small, insignificant object that tied me to him, to the past I had buried so deeply. "Excuse me, miss?" A voice broke through my thoughts, and I quickly dropped the bracelet back into the box, my heart racing. I turned around to find the manager standing a few feet away, looking at me curiously. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his eyes. "You seem upset." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to smile. "I'm fine," I said quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. Just reminiscing." He nodded, clearly not convinced, but he didn't press further. "Well, if you're looking for something in particular, just let me know." I nodded absently, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was reeling, my body frozen in place. I had to leave. I had to get out of here before I lost control of the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm me. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave without understanding what had happened. Without knowing how that bracelet had ended up in that box. I couldn't leave without knowing why he had disappeared from my life the way he did. As I stood there, my fingers curling into the fabric of my coat, I realized I was at a crossroads. The bracelet wasn't just an object. It was a symbol. It was a thread that connected the past to the present, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to pull. But I knew one thing, I couldn't walk away from it, not yet. I couldn't stop looking at the bracelet. The silver, smooth and shiny, seemed to mock me with its quiet simplicity. I had left it in the box for a reason. At first, I thought I should just let it go, pretend I had never seen it, walk away and never look back. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The weight of it, the connection it held to the past, was pulling me back in. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do. I couldn't leave without asking. Without finding out the truth. Something inside me refused to let it stay hidden, buried in that forgotten pile of lost items. I had to know what had happened. I had to know why his bracelet was here, in a place where it didn't belong. I walked over to the manager, who was now busy talking to a waitress. She smiled at him, and he waved her off, clearly lost in the midst of some paperwork. I cleared my throat, and he looked up, catching my gaze with a slightly confused but polite expression. "Hi, sorry to bother you," I began, my voice a little shaky, despite my best effort to sound calm. "I couldn't help but notice a bracelet in your lost and found box. The one with the engraving. James, do you know how it got there?" His expression softened, but there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. He looked over his shoulder at the box, as if trying to recall the events that had led up to this moment. "Oh, yeah. That one. It's been here for a while, actually. It was found a few weeks ago, left behind by a customer. I wasn't sure who it belonged to, so I just stuck it in the box." I stared at him, the words feeling heavier than I expected. "A few weeks ago? Are you sure?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice even. "Do you know the person who lost it?" The manager scratched his head, thinking. "I don't think so. We have a lot of people coming and going. But the guy who found it mentioned that it was left on the table in the corner booth. Maybe someone left it in a hurry. He didn't think much of it at the time." A sick feeling swelled in my stomach. The corner booth. That had been our spot. Our place. Where we'd spent so many quiet afternoons, talking for hours, laughing like we had all the time in the world. And now, this bracelet, was here, in front of me, as if nothing had ever changed. As if the last few years hadn't happened. I nodded slowly, processing what he said, even as my mind spiraled. And, did the person who found it mention anything else? Did they say where the bracelet might have come from? He glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not sure, but I don't think he mentioned much more. You could check with him, but I really don't know." I was about to ask for more details when the waitress came over, carrying a tray of drinks. She smiled brightly, but there was something in her eyes that made me freeze. She was looking directly at me, a little too knowingly. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle, but there was a subtle edge of curiosity behind her words. I blinked, trying to shake off the sudden discomfort. "Oh, yeah. I'm fine. Just, remembering something." She gave me a quick nod before walking away, her eyes lingering on me for just a moment longer than necessary. I was becoming increasingly aware that I was standing here, in the middle of a bustling restaurant, asking about a bracelet that shouldn't have been a part of this world anymore. The bracelet. The memories. The man I had loved. I glanced back at the manager, trying to push down the growing anxiety. "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. I thought I recognized it." He smiled back, though his expression was a little uncertain. "Of course. If you need anything else, just let me know." I nodded, walking away, but my thoughts didn't follow. They were still tied to that small bracelet. I didn't know why I couldn't just walk away and leave the past buried where it belonged. But something inside me refused to let go. The unanswered questions were clawing at me. Why was it left behind? Why hadn't he taken it with him? Was it some kind of message, or was it just a forgotten item in the shuffle of life? As I made my way back to the table where I had been sitting earlier, I found myself staring at the corner booth, the one James and I had shared countless times. It was empty now, but the memories rushed back in a flood. I could almost hear his voice, see his smile, the way he used to look at me like I was the only person in the room. Everything had felt so right back then. So perfect. But it had crumbled, quietly, without warning. And I was left here, holding the remnants of that time, trying to make sense of it all. I couldn't stop myself from picking up my phone and typing out a message. It wasn't for James. It wasn't even for anyone who could help me make sense of this. It was for me. It was a way to hold on to the pieces that were slipping away from me. I found it. The bracelet. The one he wore. I don't know what to do with it. I stared at the screen for a long time, but I didn't send it. I couldn't. What would it do, anyway? What was the point of bringing up the past when the present was all that mattered now? But that's the thing about love, isn't it? It doesn't just disappear. It lingers, even in the most unlikely places. In forgotten items. In silent corners. In the things we thought we'd left behind. I took one last look at the bracelet, tucked it carefully back into the box, and walked out of the restaurant, my mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. Maybe I wasn't ready to find the answers yet. Maybe some things were meant to stay unanswered. But I knew one thing, I couldn't escape the past. Not completely. Not yet. The next few days felt like a constant pull between the past and the present, between letting go and holding on. That bracelet, that damn bracelet, kept haunting me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it, the engraving, the delicate metal that had once been part of something I thought would last forever. But life had a way of testing your beliefs, showing you how fragile everything really was. I couldn't get the memory of James out of my head. I tried distracting myself. I spent time with friends, went on long walks, caught up on work, but nothing seemed to erase the image of him from my thoughts. The more I tried to push it away, the more it came back, stronger than before. And the worst part was that it wasn't just the bracelet, it was everything that came with it. It was the love we shared, the connection we had built, the future I thought we would have. And just like that, it was all gone. I couldn't help but wonder, was this just another chapter in my life that was meant to end? Or was it a lesson, one I hadn't learned yet? After I found the bracelet, I couldn't shake the idea that I needed answers. I needed closure. But could I really get that after all this time? Was it too late to even seek out the truth? Was I just going to tear open old wounds that had barely healed? I found myself back at the restaurant a few days later. It wasn't planned, but the pull was too strong. There was something in the air when I walked inside, a weight that seemed heavier than before. The memory of James and I sitting at that very table, talking about our hopes, our dreams, everything we wanted to do together, it all felt like a distant, almost unreal memory now. It was as if I had been living in a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The manager wasn't there, but the waitress who had been so curious about me when I first visited was. Her name was Emily, and she looked at me with an expression that bordered on pity, though she didn't say anything. I couldn't blame her. Anyone could tell something was wrong just by looking at me. I glanced over at the corner booth, the same spot we had shared so many memories in. And, just like before, there was no one sitting there. I should have left. I should have turned around, walked out, and never looked back. But I didn't. I couldn't. The questions were gnawing at me like a hunger I couldn't satiate. "Excuse me," I said, finding myself walking towards Emily before I could even think about it. Her eyes met mine, cautious but kind. "Yes?" she asked, pausing as she wiped her hands on her apron. I was wondering, I hesitated, not sure how to phrase what I needed to ask. "Do you remember the person who found the bracelet? The one with the initials JM? I need to know who it belongs to." Emily seemed taken aback for a moment, her expression shifting slightly as if trying to place me. "Oh, I don't know who it belongs to, honestly," she said after a moment. "But I remember the guy who found it. He seemed pretty young, maybe late 20s? I think he works in the city. He was here with a group of people, celebrating something. I don't know much more than that." A flicker of hope sparked in me. "Do you happen to remember anything else about him? Anything specific?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, I don't. It wasn't a big deal, so I didn't really pay attention. I just know he was polite, and he left the bracelet in the lost and found box when he couldn't figure out whose it was. I'm afraid that's all I can tell you." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The more she spoke, the more I realized that the answers I was hoping for were slipping away, just out of my reach. The man who found it hadn't been involved with the bracelet in any personal way. He didn't know its significance. It was just another forgotten object to him. But to me? It was everything. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned to leave but paused when Emily called out to me. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, more genuine. "You've been here a few times. You don't seem like yourself." I hesitated. It wasn't the kind of question I was prepared to answer. I didn't want to explain. Not to her. Not to anyone. But somehow, she seemed to see through me. Maybe it was the way I'd been clinging to the past, holding on to memories that were too painful to let go of. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile that felt so foreign to me. "I'm just figuring some things out." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't entirely believe me. But she didn't push it. She just gave me a gentle smile before returning to her work. I left the restaurant feeling empty. The answers I had hoped for were as elusive as they had always been. The questions only grew. Who had left the bracelet behind? Why had it been forgotten? And, most importantly, why did it matter so much to me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, thoughts racing. I thought about James, about us, and about the moment when everything changed. What had gone wrong? How had we gotten here? How had the love we once shared faded into silence? I knew the answers, even if I didn't want to admit them. The love I had once thought was eternal had slipped away without warning, without explanation. And now, I was left standing in the aftermath, trying to pick up the pieces. The next day, I decided I had to let it go. I couldn't keep chasing shadows, couldn't keep holding on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. I went back to the restaurant, this time with a resolve to leave the bracelet behind. To walk away from the past and embrace whatever future lay ahead. But the bracelet was still there, in the lost and found box, waiting for me. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to let go of it just yet. The bracelet lingered in my mind long after I left the restaurant. No matter how hard I tried to bury it, the image of that delicate silver band, engraved with the initials JM, stayed with me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I didn't know why it had such a hold on me. Maybe it was the connection to James, the history we shared, the time we lost. Or maybe it was just the way that one piece of jewelry seemed to symbolize everything I had hoped for, everything I thought we would become, and everything that had fallen apart. Days passed, but my thoughts kept circling back to it. I couldn't stop asking myself, what had happened to us? How had we gotten to this point where his bracelet was now just a relic, lying forgotten in a restaurant's lost and found box? I could almost feel the weight of that question pressing against my chest every time I tried to focus on anything else. But no matter how many times I turned over the situation in my head, no matter how many distractions I found, I couldn't stop myself from wanting answers. I had to understand what happened. I couldn't keep living with this sense of abandonment, with the feeling that I had been left hanging without any explanation. What if James had left me something more than just the bracelet? What if there was more to the story than I'd ever known? I decided to go back to the restaurant. It wasn't something I'd planned, but it was something I couldn't avoid any longer. There was a gnawing feeling inside of me, a restless urge to know more, to finally lay the past to rest. And so, I found myself walking back through the same doors, heading straight for the lost and found box, as though my feet were carrying me there without my permission. The restaurant was quieter now than it had been during my last visit, the midday rush long gone. I looked around, almost half expecting to see him, James, sitting at the table where we used to sit. But of course, he wasn't there. And neither was the past, no matter how much I wished I could pull it back into the present. I walked up to the counter, my heart racing again. Emily was there, wiping down the counter. She glanced up at me, and I caught the flash of recognition in her eyes. She didn't say anything right away, but she studied me for a long moment. "You came back," she said, her voice light but curious. I nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot. About the bracelet." She raised an eyebrow, her expression softening. "I figured you might. It seems like it means something to you." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. There were so many emotions swirling in my chest, anger, confusion, sadness, but mostly, there was a deep longing. A longing for closure, for answers, for anything that could explain why everything had turned out the way it did. "I just need to know how it ended up here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand." Emily gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I'm not sure I can give you the answers you're looking for," she said slowly. "But I can tell you more about the guy who found it." I felt a surge of hope. "Please," I urged, leaning in slightly, desperate for something, anything, that might shed light on the mystery. She glanced around the room, as if making sure no one else was listening, and then lowered her voice. "The guy who found it? I remember him. He was sitting with a group of people, but I think he was by himself for a little bit. He was kind of distracted, didn't talk much to anyone at his table. At one point, he got up and left the bracelet behind. We didn't think much of it at the time, but he seemed off. Like something was bothering him." I frowned, trying to process what she was saying. "Off how?" She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "It's hard to explain, but he seemed distant, like he wasn't really there. Like he was just going through the motions. I don't know, maybe he'd had a bad day, or maybe he just wasn't interested in the company he was with. but it stood out. I remember it clearly because, for a moment, it felt like he didn't belong in the group. He didn't belong here. Her words hit me like a wave. My heart pounded, and I had to take a step back to steady myself. Everything she was saying seemed to add up, and yet, it didn't. It wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't a simple story of a bracelet being forgotten. It was more complicated than that. The more I heard, the more questions formed in my mind. Emily continued, I never asked him about it. But I thought it was strange. Maybe he left it on purpose, maybe it was just a symbol of something he didn't want to keep anymore. Or maybe he didn't even realize it was his. Who knows? I swallowed hard. The possibility that the bracelet had been left behind intentionally, that James had decided he no longer needed it, no longer needed me, felt like a punch to the gut. It was too much to bear. But what if it's not his? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. What if it belongs to someone else? Emily shrugged, a small, uncertain gesture. I guess you could ask the guy if he's ever been back, but we haven't seen him again. If it helps, though, I think it was definitely his. It just felt right, like it belonged to him. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on me like an anchor. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I was beginning to understand that maybe the answers weren't as important as I thought they were. Maybe it didn't matter why the bracelet had been left behind, or why James had disappeared without a trace. Maybe the real question was what I was going to do with it now. What did I do with all the love, all the pain, all the time I'd spent on a man who, for whatever reason, had walked away? I left the restaurant feeling emptier than when I had walked in, but strangely, I felt like I was starting to make peace with it. Maybe closure wasn't something I could find by asking others for answers. Maybe closure was something I had to give to myself. And maybe, just maybe, I could finally let go of the past. The days after my last visit to the restaurant felt like a slow unraveling, but in a way that was freeing. I didn't have the answers I had hoped for, but somewhere deep inside, I began to realize that perhaps I wasn't supposed to have them. The questions had haunted me for weeks, months even, but now they didn't hold the same power over me. I could feel myself changing, moving forward, as if the heavy weight of uncertainty had begun to lift just a little bit more each day. I still thought about James, how could I not? He had been a part of my life for so long, and the memories of us, of everything we had shared, would always linger somewhere in the background. But the anger, the bitterness, the desperate need for closure, it was starting to fade. And in its place, I found something unexpected, peace. The kind of peace that comes from acceptance, from letting go of things that were never meant to be. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything I had learned, everything I had been through. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I was finally starting to understand that the past, no matter how painful, could not define my future. I couldn't change the fact that James had left, that our love had been lost in the shuffle of life. But I could control how I moved forward from it. I could decide what kind of person I wanted to be, with or without the memories that had once held me captive. The bracelet still lingered in my mind, though I hadn't gone back to the restaurant to see it again. Emily's words echoed in my thoughts, and I began to make sense of them. The bracelet might have been left behind on purpose, but maybe it didn't mean anything more than that. Maybe it wasn't a symbol of a love lost, it was simply an object, an item that held memories, yes, but nothing more. The memories I had of James were mine alone, and no object, no piece of jewelry, could ever define them for me. I decided to stop thinking of the bracelet as a symbol of something unfinished. It wasn't unfinished, it was just a part of the past. And I needed to move on from it. I didn't need to search for meaning in every detail, in every moment we had shared. The meaning was in the living, in the experience itself. And now, it was time for me to live again. The next week, I packed a small bag, deciding on a weekend trip to clear my head, to be in a new place, away from the reminders that had been keeping me stuck. I needed to give myself space to breathe, to rediscover who I was without the shadows of the past constantly hovering over me. The trip was exactly what I needed. Being away from everything that had tied me to my old life felt like a breath of fresh air. I didn't think about James. I didn't think about the restaurant or the bracelet. I just let myself be in the moment, appreciating the beauty of the world around me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly living again. When I came back home, I had a sense of calm that I hadn't had in years. The weight of the past had finally been lifted, and I realized that the love I had with James, as wonderful and painful as it had been, was not the end of my story. It was just one chapter. And it was time to turn the page. I didn't visit the restaurant again, not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer felt the need to search for answers in places where they couldn't be found. The restaurant, the bracelet, the memories, all of it was part of who I had been, but it didn't define who I was becoming. I wasn't the same person I was when I found the bracelet. I had grown. I had changed. And now, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The past would always be a part of me. But it no longer held the power to control me. I let go of the bracelet, symbolically, at least. I let go of the questions, the uncertainty, and the pain. And I chose, for the first time in a long time, to choose myself.